Shalom l'kulam. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. And it's great to have all of you with us. I know, as usual, we have an audience from around the world, from Israel, from the US, Canada, the UK, and elsewhere. Welcome to the latest in these weekly sessions that we've been doing on Zoom in English for the past year and a half or so, in which I've been hosting, speaking to a guest, talking about some area of Israeli history or Israeli politics or the Jewish world. Today is something a little bit different. I think it would be fair to say we're leaving, obviously, because with the Begin Center, we're dealing with a lot of things that are connected to the legacy of Menachem Begin and the interests of and ideas of Menachem Begin, including policy, foreign policy, the Jewish people, anti-Semitism, all those kinds of things. But of course, a major plank of Menachem Begin's philosophy was his love of and commitment to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. So I think it's very appropriate that we look at, that we do for the first time actually in these sessions, a virtual tour of parts of the land of Israel. And in looking for a sort of pretext for that, or a sort of excuse for that, I found the perfect one because a wonderful tour guide of my acquaintance and someone I've known for a long time and worked with for a long time has also become a novelist. Josh Even Chen, who you'll meet very shortly, is someone that I worked with for the first time 7 or 8 years ago, I believe, on a program that I used to run here at the Begin Center for diaspora Jews coming here for a year. And part of the program was tours around the country. And we always had with us, to accompany us and educate us, Josh Even Chen. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Josh to the Zoom. Hey, Josh. For him to talk about a little bit about his book, because I think it's only fair if he's on that he gets the chance to promote his book, but also, and I think more, perhaps more for the bulk of the session, for Josh to use his book as a springboard for a virtual tour using the wonders of modern technology of Eretz Israel, of important historical Jewish sites in the land of Israel. Josh, can you unmute yourself?
Unmuted.
Great. Okay, so Josh, you're originally from the United States, from North Carolina.
As I like to say, I'm probably originally from Israel, but I don't know if it's from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. I was born in Wilmington, North Carolina. My family came on Aliyah back in 1978. Guilty as charged.
Nice of you. Okay, that's the year I was born. Sorry to make you feel old. I won't ask how old you were when you made Aliyah. But you've written this. But after how many years have you been? North Carolina. Oh, sorry. We're getting let me just deal with that. I'm probably originally from... Okay, sorry about that. You've been a tour guide for how many years?
I guess I've been a tour guide for just over 20 years, and I've been involved in Jewish education for about 30 years.
Right. And now you're also a novelist. You can add that to your resume.
I can add that to my resume. I guess so. But just like we were talking about before, since the first time that we had the pleasure of meeting and working together ever since was in the context of touring Israel, for the benefit of all the viewers and listeners, the program that Paul directed is not like a tour that you go around sightseeing in Israel. Everything that we did, it's also not just another program. It's a 10-month program commitment where Jews from all over the world, from almost every single continent. I don't think we ever had anybody from Antarctica, but from dozens of countries participated in this. It's really considered to be like the flagship of the birthright style, or Masada, which are long-term birthright programs.
Yeah.
And everywhere we went in the country always had like a political educational component to it, whether it was political and environment, or political and economy, or all sorts of other domestic and international issues. And the same in tourism, that I mostly do educational tourism. So it's not just where we are, it's why we are. It's why we are where we are.
So what led you to this point where you wrote this novel, and with these themes of this novel, which we're going to ask you about?
It's something that grew. It started about 8 years ago. I don't know if I could pinpoint the exact moment, the eureka moment, when I had the idea. It's hard for me to say this with women in the audience, but I think it's probably the closest like a man can get to childbirth, where something starts growing inside of you, and whether you want it to happen or not, that baby, or book in this case, is going to come out. And it really just took on a life of its own. And that was about 8 years ago, and it took me about 1.5 years to write it. You asked me how long. I think at that time it was something like 36 years of being involved in something like this. And you can see the title 36. It's just another sort of 36 element there. About 1.5 years maybe to write it, but it was Corona. I didn't write it during Corona, but Corona allowed me the time to polish it up and to get it out there and bring it out to the world.
Right. Yeah. I mean, tour guides had a pretty rough time this past 1.5 years. Okay. So without spoilers, so the book's called The 36.
Yes.
Without spoilers, because obviously we want people to buy the book and read the book. Can you tell us about the plot of the book? Because it's set in 3 different time periods, well, right?
Really, it's two. It has a minor storyline, and then a major storyline. The minor storyline happens in between the years of the year 70 and 73. There's no apostrophe. First century, 70, 73. Specifically, it happens from the eve of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, in the year 70. And it culminates with what happens 3 years later, the last stand of Masada, when the Romans conquer Masada. So
the destruction of the temple,
yes,
in 70, and then Masada 3 years later.
Correct. And that's a minor storyline that's woven throughout the narrative. And the major storyline happens around the year 2010. There are a few jumps there in the 21st century, or maybe the very end of the 20th century, but it's mostly, almost all of it is in 2010. And the genre of the book, the style of the book, is certainly, I would say, the Dan Brown-ish style. It's very, if people have read the Da Vinci Code, it's very much in that style. There's a quest, there's conflict, there's mystery, there's clues, there's something that needs to be followed. There's a path that has to be followed. And what I very much connect with this also in my guiding style, that often people ask me, even as a guide, where we're going, and somehow I'll always manage to bring in concepts of, even as tourists, when you're in Israel, it's not just about where you're going, it's about the journey of how you're getting there, what you're experiencing en route. Right.
Yeah, it's certainly my experience of traveling with you as guide. And obviously when you're talking about historical events, as you are in the case of going back to the end of the Second Temple, how much of what you write is established historical fact, and how much of it is your interpretation or your sort of imagining of what happened?
Well, that's a great question. People ask me, so is it fact or fiction? Is it fiction or nonfiction? And the answer is yes. That is, it is fiction and it is nonfiction. It's a story of a quest and a mystery and intrigue. However, it is firmly grounded and steeped in history and archeology and Judaism in sources. I guess another way to say this is that it is a fictional story within the framework of a nonfiction book.
Fictional story in the framework of a nonfiction book. So okay, and the nonfiction. So was there a historical story, like a real factual historical event or series of events that you wanted people to understand through reading the book, which you kind of figured, you know, they're more likely to get it. They're more likely to pick up this thriller than pick up a sort of dry history book. Was
Right.
that part of the thinking?
For sure. I would say that essentially what I've been doing for the past 20 years is I've been using leisure tourism as a vehicle to educate about Israel, Judaism, Zionism, other concepts that are out there. And what I did here is I simply utilized leisure reading to achieve the same goals. So that's why, for instance, the characters, the protagonists, as they travel throughout the land of Israel, and they do travel throughout the land of Israel, then there's exposition of what they see, of the landscape, of the heritage, of the history, of the geography, of the archeology, the culture, the peoples. It's all there. How much of it is accurate? I'd say that 99% of the geographical descriptions are accurate. 99% of the historical descriptions are accurate. I believe that probably almost every single person reading the book will get to some sections of like, oh yeah, I think I remember hearing that or being there or something. And everybody will probably be like, no, that can't be right. But it is. It's historical and factual, and certainly the descriptions of the sites and the history, the geography and the history.
Okay, and also interesting in terms of the choices that you made when writing the book is that you're also touching on some contemporary Israeli issues, because the main protagonist is, I think, from a ultra-Orthodox, a sort of a secular sort of escapee or refugee from an ultra-Orthodox community.
Yes.
So it's touching also on those issues, right? Someone who left the ultra-Orthodox world and is very much antagonistic towards it in some way. That's also part of the story.
Absolutely. There are actually two protagonists. When I wrote the book, I was debating who would be the hero and through what lens. And actually, I don't know if I really thought about this way, Paul, but since you know that almost everywhere we went, I would always try my best to present, and we dealt with a lot of sensitive topics on religion, on politics, a lot of different, very, very sensitive topics. I always did my best to present at least two sides of an issue, sometimes more, but present them each with passion and with belief and with foundation. And that's what I try to do here as well. So the two protagonists are coming from very different worldviews. And they're brothers, they're twins, actually, identical twins. And I would say that their struggles in many ways are my struggles, and not just my struggles. They're these struggles of modern Israel, modern Israelis. And it comes up in their conversations, in their, the journey that they're essentially doing together. There's a tremendous amount of antagonism, as only brothers can be antagonistic ones towards another. But I would say that the reconciliation, and there is reconciliation, is in a way, it's also my hope and vision in a cultural sense, in a societal sense.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I want to make sure we have a lot of time for the main event, which is the tour. So I'm not going to ask you more questions now that for those of you on the call, on the meeting, please do write any questions you have about the book or anything that you're about to hear from Josh in the chat, and we will try and get to questions before we finish the event today. So use the chat facility at the bottom to write in your questions there. I hope we have Josh has sort of whetted your appetite to read the book. It's available on Amazon and Book Depository and other places, I'm sure. Go to Amazon and enter the 36 or Josh's name. The advantage of it being his only book so far is that you'll find it easily by entering his name into Amazon. So do that. And I'm going to now hand over to Josh. He's going to share his screen, and using the book and using passages from the book, he's going to take us on a tour of some important and historical Jewish sites in the land of Israel.
Fantastic. Well, Paul, thank you very much. And also thank you very much for hosting me in this form of esteem, I could say. And I'm humbled by being here. And I see that a lot of people are with us this evening. And some of the names I recognize from a long time ago. I just need to give one shout out to my in-laws, David and Judy Marwick, who are part of the Zoom here, coming from Silver Spring, Maryland. And it's wonderful to see them and all the other faces and names that we see here on the screen. So I'll just, I just give a heads up. I know that when I'm watching something on Zoom or YouTube or something, we all do it. We sort of click on the screen and how much longer is this? And how do I do that control where I can sort of play it at 1.25? So because we're on the live, the disadvantage is you can't do that, but the advantage is you do get to ask questions. And it's not a problem. And Paul can field those questions. Whatever we don't get to during the discussion, we can field at the end. But I do want to give a heads up as far as what I hope to do with you guys this evening. First of all, is an introduction, which we basically covered. I'll just add a couple more sentences of an introduction. And then we're going to go to 3 different places. It's going to be in 3 stages. The first one is going to be more conceptual. And the second 2 are going to be much more geographically specific to sites in Israel. And then we'll do a little bit of a summary, because I'm sure part of that summary will also be getting back to one of the questions that's in the minds of many of you, and that is the 36. What is that? I think I know the 36. I think it has something to do about the Lamed Vavnikim, righteous men. I'm not quite sure where I heard it. My grandfather told me about it. I'm not quite sure. We'll get back to that. We'll get back to who the 36 are in the summary. So the last few lines I'll add here to the introduction is people have also asked me, is it historical fiction? It is not historical fiction. The history is nonfiction, and the fiction certainly is. But in the minor storyline, which I want to get back to in a moment, which happens during those 3 years of the first century, there is a little bit of, or maybe more than a little bit of revisionist history. Meaning I am telling the story, but I am presenting it in a way that's never been presented before. Most of the data is accurate, almost all the data. What is my interpretation, what is my license here that I'm bringing as an author are the conversations and here's the twist, is what exactly did happen when the temple was burning to the ground? Who exactly caused that event, and how is it related to the story of Masada? Because I'm presenting in the book, there's an intricate link between those 2 events, and there's an incredible connection between those 2 events as one unit and what is going on here in the main narrative of the book, which is again happening in the 21st century. So that's the end of the introduction. And like we already mentioned as part of the introduction, that the modern storyline, which again is the major part of the book, follows the 2 protagonists. Their names are Adir and Yitzchak, and it follows them as they are searching for their father, who has been abducted, and their search turns into a quest to rescue their father, to locate the hidden, lost temple treasures, artifacts, vessels, and essentially very much interwoven throughout the entire novel is a quest to find themselves. So with that being said, I'm going to do a share screen. The speed that you'll be able to see what I'm sharing might differ depending on your own computers, your own connections. So this here is Google Earth presentations. From my experience of doing this in the past, not everybody knows what Google Earth presentation is. So I'll just give a brief intro here, that here you can see our wonderful planet, okay? And essentially people do know Google Earth and they know PowerPoint, but they don't know that you can actually combine PowerPoint and Google Earth. And that is exactly what we're doing right now. We are now heading, one second, here we go. There's our land of Israel, and we're zooming in on Jerusalem. Here we can see, on Jerusalem, we can see the old city. You can see the words, the Dome of the Rock, and the Temple Mount. That is what you can see right now. And I said this first stage, this first stop on our tour is going to be more conceptual, because the site of the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Temple Mount, Harabait, Haram al-Sharif, whether you're pronouncing it in English, Hebrew, or Arabic, is going to mean different things to different people. But I would say one common denominator is that it's very holy to many, many people throughout the world. The origins of this, of it being holy to many people, can be traced back to different periods in time. Some people might trace it back to 6,000 years ago, essentially from a traditional Jewish perspective, from the creation of man, as in Adam and Eve. That is certainly a Jewish tradition that appears in Talmudic literature. Other people might put it at about 4,000 years ago, because that is the traditional site of the binding of Isaac. And some people might say that really it starts from maybe 3,000 years ago, where we have this structure, which I'm bringing up now, making it larger on the screen for everybody. This is an artist's rendition of the Solomonic temple, the temple of King Solomon, which dates back to about 2,950 years ago. That's what we can see here. There were many vessels that were used in this temple. There are 4 classic ones. Everybody, or I think almost everybody, is familiar with the menorah, and there were others as well. However, it was not the first time in Jewish history where these were being used. They were first created in the desert by Moses and others, by Bezalel, Aholiab, other biblical characters that appear in the 5 books of Moses. These vessels and items were created. They were used in the tabernacle. They continued to be used in the tabernacle when it was brought into the land of Israel. The major place was in Shiloh, where the tabernacle stood for close to 400 years, 369 years. But it also stood in other places. Were they always there? No, they got looted, okay? They were often went missing. One of the most famous events is when the Philistines they won in battle, essentially. They won the Ark of the Covenant, and that's a story that's spoken about in the books of Samuel. But later, other people would make vessels, and that's what you would have found in the Solomonic temple. Much later, after that temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, which would be about 2,600 years ago in 586 BCE, very likely the Babylonians stole or took as loot, however you want to phrase it, depending on which side of that war you might have been on. They took whatever they could find. There are traditions. There is a very strong tradition that one of those items at least survived, and that would be the Ark of the Covenant. And that is due to the foresight of King Solomon and one of his great-great-grandchildren, a guy named King Josiah. And they hid it. And they hid it under the temple as an integral part of the Mount Moriah. Now, what you're seeing on the screen right now is yet another temple in the exact same location. This photograph is taken from the Israel Museum's what's called the Holy Land model, which was created back in the 1970s. And this is what the temple would have looked like in the Herodian era. So when the Romans were here 1,970 years ago, 50 years ago, 1,950 years ago, in the year 70, this is what they would have seen. This is what was destroyed. Sometimes people ask, but the vessels, are they real? Are they still wandering around? And different things like that. There are many, many different theories, and I'm not going to get into any of them right now because they're just too many, but I will, as the last thing, as far as the conceptual matter, that's one of the foundations of the book, is this here. This actually can be seen on tour in a place called the Herodian Mansions in the Jewish quarter of the Old City today. It is located about 10 to 15 feet underground in an area that's accessible. You just have to pay a small entrance fee to what's called the Herodian Mansions. It acts as a museum in situ. You're walking through the basements of these mansions that were part of the higher part of Jewish society of 2,000 years ago. And etched in the wall, you can see 3 objects. The one that is most obvious is a menorah, and the 2 others are 2 other smaller vessels that were also part of the temple. One is called the showbread table, and the other is called the golden altar. But what's, in my opinion, the most amazing here is you can find many depictions of menorahs in all over Jewish traditions and synagogues and homes and coins over the past 2,000 years. However, this one was drawn in the wall by someone who actually saw it when it was in the temple, because the people who owned this house were of the priestly class. They had jobs in the temple. They went to work. They came home. They were inspired, and someone had the idea, hey, let's decorate our wall with this. And that's what we can see today. It's in Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to close this, okay? And from here, we're just going to do a quick stop over towards Masada, because I told you also that Masada plays a significant part in the minor narrative. And that's what we're seeing over here. We're saying, I'm going to do a 360. There it is. As we rotate 360, you have a much better understanding of Masada, of how on three sides it's surrounded by 1,200 foot or 400 meter cliffs, with the exception of the western side, which is only 100 meters deep, or that would be about 350 feet deep on the western side. And that's why you have Peter O'Toole and Peter Strauss in the very classic early 1980s three-part TV series. Very much you'll understand when you read the book, the connection between what I'm about to read and what happens on Masada between the years 70 and 73. Now I'm going to take a brief pause here for a minute in order to, 1 minute, there we go. I'm just going to take a brief pause here to read a small section of the book. It's one of the first chapters. It's one of the, I would say, even more challenging than writing the book is choosing, so what am I going to read? I want to read all of it, but how many hours do we have? It's only 500 pages long, but I won't read 500 pages. So I'm reading the chapters that deal with the 2,000 years ago narrative tend to be much shorter. So I'm just going to read you this one. I might also skip a few sentences just in interest of time. And this is placing me at an event that we all know about, but we don't really know what happened there. And I'm referring to the night of the 9th of Av, of Tisha B'Av in the year 70, as the temple is going in flames. And I'm taking you actually inside of the temple to someone who was there. And this is where I'm reading from. Okay, so it's the 9th of Av, the Hebrew calendar of 3,830, which the Gregorian calendar would be the 2nd of August in the year 70 CE. And here I go. The second option provided Eleazar's salvation. Of course, I'm picking up here in the middle of the stories, but I think you'll catch on. The Roman had seen him and knew he was inside. As long as there was only the secret passage, he dared not use it. If no corpse was left behind, they would seek out his secret escape route. This was a risk he could not take. He could not jeopardize the hidden relic. The thought of its power in the infidel's hands was too nauseating to consider. Such an atrocity when, I quote, the glory had been exiled from Israel, for the ark of God had been taken, had not occurred, close quote, had not occurred since the days of Eli the priest, when the Philistines wrestled it from the Israelites. Realizing that there was another option, one with a visible portico from the outside, he knew the Romans would assume that that was his way out. They would not search for alternatives. This obvious option allowed him to utilize the other. His master's words echoed in his mind. I quote, the cherubs will lead the way, end quote. Eleazar raced through the winding subterranean passage. Indeed, the cherubs, the hallmark of the Ark of the Covenant, the figures in Ezekiel's vision of the chariot, marked the secret entrance, providing the signs. After a few hundred meters, he exited into an enormous cavern. The gloom swallowed his torch's light. I'm skipping here a few lines. His work done, Eleazar knew that there was nothing more in the city worth living for, worth fighting for, worth dying for. After hundreds of years, Jerusalem's beating heart was silent. He had never anticipated surviving beyond this point, and yet his God had spared him. Evidently, there was still important work to be done before the end, and he would not disappoint God nor his master. Eleazar ben Yair, he promised himself through gritted teeth, as God is your witness, your work is not yet done, but you will succeed in your goal if it's the last thing you do. And so he raced from the burning city, joining the throngs of refugees escaping east to the desert, maybe even to the fortress of Masada. I'm pausing there for a minute because you might already recognize that Eleazar ben Yair might be a name that you recognize from history and not from my own imagination. My imagination placed him in the temple as it was going up in flames, but he is the leader, what he will become the leader on Masada, and that is history. That is not my own mind. And the last paragraph here, before we move on, is part of the same chapter. At that very moment of Eleazar's hasty escape, an injured Roman officer stumbled across the inner courtyard of the Temple Mount Plaza. His lungs gasped for oxygen, his hair singed, his entire body covered in soot. With tremendous effort, he shambled down the steps and onto the Temple Mount platform, distancing himself from the conflagration behind. His energy was utterly spent, but at the moment before he collapsed unconscious on the ground, he identified a small portal around to the side. With certainty, he concluded, albeit incorrectly, that it was through there the Jewish rebel responsible for tonight's debacle had escaped. Debacle. Lucius Flavius Silva, he growled to himself through gritted teeth. As Jupiter is your witness, you're going to kill that bastard if it's the last thing you do. So here, already in the beginning of the book, I'm setting up something that will be climactic at the end. And Paul said, be careful, of spoilers. But the fact is that anybody who's been to Masada or has read the history understands that there are two main characters in that 3-year saga. On the Jewish side, you have Elazar ben Yair, and on the Roman side, you have a guy named Lucius Flavius Silva. And what I did is I simply had them meet 3 years prior, leading up to that event at the end of Masada. So with that brings to a close stage 1 of 3 in our virtual tour. Like I said, the first one is more conceptual regarding the vessels of the temple. Are they out there, and how that connects to the plot? That I'm not going to get into, but they are an integral part of the plot, nonetheless. Paul, are there any questions I should be addressing at this point? Or okay, so we are going to be moving on. The second part is going to take us into the geography. So just a couple lines of understanding. What does that mean is the geography? The brothers, these two protagonists, they travel to some of the most holy and inaccessible and controversial sites in all of Israel. Now, I have to say, I've done Zoom tours. I've done virtual tours in the past year or so. At first, I was very much against them. It just didn't sit well with me because I'm used to being in the field. But Corona, what are you going to do? So I tried to turn the disadvantage into an advantage. And often when I do virtual tours, I tend to focus the tour not on places that I can take you to or could take you to in the past or will take you to in the future, but actually, guess what? There are plenty of places in Israel that even in the best of times, I can't take you there, usually for issues of security or tradition or spirituality or who knows what. And that's exactly where we are going to be going. And that's exactly where my protagonists go in the book as well. They interact and access inaccessible sites. Now, how they do it, that's in the book. But I will take you to at least one or two of those sites nonetheless, at least one of them. So with that, I'm going to take you back to the Google Earth. And this is going to be a connection. Here we go. We're back on Google Earth. And I'm taking you back to Jerusalem. I know we were just in Jerusalem. We're going back there. We're focusing once again on the Old City, which we can see, but I'm focusing not on the Temple Mount, but rather on the northern side of the Old City. And this cave that I'm about to take you into is going to be a connecting point in between the minor narrative, the secondary narrative that's happening 2,000 years ago, and the narrative happening in the 21st century. So once again, I'm just going to spin around here and not that one, sorry, wrong button. I'm just spinning around here just so you can see a little bit of the environment that today is very much built up, and it's an urban environment. Now I'm looking towards the south. I'm looking at the Dome of the Rock at the top left of the screen, and I'm going to zero in. I'm going to stop the spinning screen, just take it back to 2D. I'm going to zero in here. I'm going to take you down to what's called street level. Here we go. Buckle up, because we're about to make a landing. On to the street just outside of Damascus Gate. Okay, this is Google Earth here. The gate that you can see in front of you, I'll zero in on that. That gate is called the Damascus Gate. It has other names as well. We'll just suffice with Damascus Gate. However, I'm not going to take you into the gate. Instead, I'm going to take you about 200 meters, about 700 feet, just due east of the Damascus Gate. So I'm just strolling here as if we're crab walking, as it were. I'm still looking due south as I'm walking east. So again, I'm looking south as I'm walking east. And in just a moment, you're going to see past these olive trees, you're going to see an opening at the base of the wall. I'm zeroing in on it. Now you can see there's a green door in the center of the screen. It's a green metal grate door that is barricading and opening that's built or opens into the bedrock. And on top of the bedrock, you can see the walls of the old city. That's the northern wall of the old city. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you into that door. That is the opening to a cave called Solomon's Cave, and known by others as Zedekiah's Cave. So if I turn around this way, looking north, you'll see the opening. That's where the sunlight is streaming in, because this picture was taken during the day, although some of them may be night pictures. This is a day picture. And I'm going to start walking down a flight of steps. This cave is a cave that is accessible to the public, or has been on and off since I started guiding about over 20 years ago. There were some years that it was accessible and other years that it was not accessible. So this is partially accessible. Currently it is, and I don't know what the future holds. It is 9,000 square meter cave. In feet, that's 96,000 square foot quarry. It mostly dates, as far as historians and archaeologists can tell, it mostly dates from the Herodian and late Islamic periods, fueling many of the major building projects of Jerusalem. Jews, however, do not call it Solomon's Cave. Jews typically throughout history have called it Zedekiah's Cave, based on Jeremiah 52. In the book of Jeremiah 52, it talks about the destruction of the first temple. And there's a quote there that says that the king and those that were with him escaped through a gate that was between the double walls. There's a much later commentary on that verse, and the great commentator Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, who lived in the 11th century, also brings this quote and says, a cave extends from Zedekiah's, that is the king's palace. The king's palace was in the center of the city somewhere. A subterranean cave passageway extends from the palace all the way to the plains of Jericho, and he fled through these caves. So if legend has any historical truth to it, in this case, it is indicative that indeed there is a passageway that connects the interior of the biblical city to the outskirts of the biblical city. So what I just read to you about Elazar making escape, again, there's no historical record of that event, but it is all firmly grounded in passageways that either have been found or have been spoken about in many, many different texts, some modern and some much more ancient. So that is a little bit more about Zedekiah's Cave, but that's not all. But wait, don't touch those buttons, because there's more. So far, what I've showed you is a cave, and you're like, okay, it's a big underground cave. It was a quarry. So what? Well, there's a little bit more of so what here. So let's bring this picture up. This is a picture of the cave that we were just in. This is the largest cavern within the cave system. There's many, many different areas. Many of them are not open to the public. This is an etching that was found in the cave. And you don't need a large stretch of the imagination to see that it is some sort of beast with wings. Is that a cherub? Is that something that resembles a cherub? Does that remind us of Ezekiel's vision of the chariot that talks about winged beasts? Perhaps. No one can tell you exactly what it is, but it is part of that cave. And I also made use of this in my book. And the last thing of the pictures here is this smudge, the darkened area in the center of your screens right now, is I won't call it a spring, but it is, let's call it it's a dripping of water. I don't know if it's from someone's leaky faucet or if it's from rainwater. It could be both, but it is water that drips into the cave, and people have venerated that site, and they call it Zedekiah's tears. Bringing to mind Zedekiah, that same king that fled through the system, and also connects with his undoing. Once the Babylonians eventually did catch him, they put out his eyes, and before they actually blinded him, they killed all of his sons in front of those seeing eyes, and then they blinded him. So naturally, there was a lot of tears there, and this is called Zedekiah's tears. These are just some of the things that add to the mystery of this cave, of Zedekiah's Cave. Last but not least, here we have a group of strangely dressed, or perhaps strangely dressed men, dating to the end of the 19th century. This cave, and this does appear in the book as well, I do recount the story, how a certain James Barclay, back in the 1850s, discovered this cave for the first time, bringing it to the imagination of many, many different people, including this group here. If you don't recognize the photograph, these are Masons, as in these are Freemasons. So the Freemasons actually, at least from the 19th century and perhaps before, have been utilizing this cave at least once a year for ceremonies, for get-togethers. I used to work at an organization that was in charge of this cave, and once a year they would contact us and they would rent it out for this type of thing. Yes, they are still going on today. The Freemasons are still very much part of the woof and warp of life around the world. And this is that very cave. So if I haven't yet convinced you that there is more to this cave than just a hollow underground space, then I think that these last pictures, although they're not connected with the book per se, you do understand, of course, that there is a tremendous amount of mystery and more than meets the eye when we're talking about this cave. Again, Solomon's cave and or Zedekiah's cave, either way, that's what it is. Just to give you the dimensions, if I take you back here again to the here's the old city. The old city right now is now filling up your screen. This is Damascus Gate over here where I'm pointing with the cursor. That cave extends through underneath the entire area here. Again, about 96,000 square feet. That's quite a distance. So that is the end of our second part of our virtual tour, Zedekiah's Cave. Again, a place that I can take you to. You might have been, but most people have not been there, and it's not always open to the public. Now I'm going to stop the share screen again and take you back to me. And hello again. Now I can see your faces. When I have you on share screen, I can't see anybody. So if you're going to leave, then's the time to leave when I can't see you. So the third part here, I'm going to share with you some of the more modern aspects of the book. And Paul already very nicely introduced that more than just, I don't know, a chase, a quest, it also deals with real issues. Here I'm going to read you something that I just think is maybe will give you an insight to how I try to, in the book, because it's also what I do when I educate, how to try to show things that a lot of people are familiar with, and yet for some reason we've never, I'll speak about myself, I've never really stopped to ask really why. And I try to give it sometimes new ideas, new insights. And it comes up all the time when you're guiding people who are interested. So I'm reading to you here from the, and we're going to read just a few different paragraphs with some skipping in between. This is the first time the main protagonist, well, there's two, but the first main protagonist as he's introduced, his name is Adir. Like Paul said, he grew up in an ultra-Orthodox family and he left that world, very happily left that world. It was not for him. And he's in the home of his father and he sees a scene that is not very pleasant. And I'm reading to you like this. There, one second. In many Orthodox homes, books were the prized family possessions. They covered every available wall space from floor to ceiling. These were the most sacred objects of any scholar, and his father revered them. As a young, inquisitive child, Adir would often ask his father's questions, and the answers were invariably accompanied by a visit to the written source. A wise man, his father would say, with a crooked smile, is not he who knows the answer, but rather he who knows where to look it up. If a book of religious content fell to the ground, it was picked up and kissed. Why do you kiss the book when you close it, Abba? A 5-year-old Adir asked one day. Do they get lonely when we leave them? Does a book get hurt if it falls? His father smiled at him, considering his words carefully. Adir, he said, some of your malamdim, your teachers, have told you that we kiss the books because they are holy and contain God's name. Therefore, we want to show signs of respect. What do you think of that? This was his father's way, answering a question with questions. Well, Adir hesitated, not wishing to blatantly contradict his teachers. I think that a book does not have feelings and God can take care of himself. I'm skipping a few lines here. He basically sends Adir to go think about it for a few days. I pick it up when they reunite, and he says the following. he says, Adir returned to his father and said, Abba, it is not the books that are hurt when they fall. It is us. That is the opposite. Because his father said, sometimes he says, when people act in a way that is hard to understand, you need to look in the opposite direction for it to make sense. And that's the conclusion that he comes to. It's not the books that are hurt when they fall. It is us. That is the opposite. His father looked up from the Talmud he was studying. Adir, he said, you are so smart. You see, we are indeed the people of the book. And these books are part of our nature. It is not the book that is lonely when we close it. Rather, it is us. We hurt when they fall. It is our souls that go up in flames if, God forbid, they are burned. Now you understand that a Jew kisses a book because it is we that need the comfort, not the book. And indeed, God can take care of himself. But through our actions, we remind God and ourselves that we too, from time to time, require being picked up and kissed. So this is a bit of Adir's reminiscing, but it's a world that he very much left. And I'm now going to introduce you to where he meets his estranged Hasidic brother. He's still in his father's apartment. While focused on the phone screen, something caught the corner of his eye. He dropped to one knee and in a split second had his weapon leveled at the left eye of the person standing in front of him. The black-garbed figure before him raised his hands in slow motion. That's one way to greet a person, he said, although I generally go for the more traditional Shalom Aleichem. Adir lowered his weapon. Yitzhak, what are you doing here, he asked. You know, Adir, that's a question that I should be asking you. He looked slowly around at the home's devastation and horror. What have you done? Only one of us here has a record of book burning, and it isn't me, Adir retorted. As you can see already from the beginning, they haven't seen each other for quite some time, and already there's some friction there. I'm skipping another few pages just to get you into what will take me to our third of the different places that I plan to have you on tour. I'm going to take you, one moment. They receive a note, classic style, a note, basically like a ransom note, and it has a riddle on it, which they need to decipher. And I'll already take you now. So again, minor spoiler, but I really don't think it's that much of a spoiler. So I'm just going to read it to you anyway. This is the last part that I'm reading here regarding the intro into where we're going next. And this is their discussion. The Jewish faith holds that the entire land of Israel is holy earth, but one specific site is even holier than anywhere else, mainly due to what or who is in it? Man, as in the first man, Adam. Our tradition identifies the burial site of Adam along with the matriarchs and patriarchs in the city of Hebron. Hence, the entire city corresponds, from a Jewish perspective, with the element of earth. Adir remained unconvinced by what he considered to be a rather dubious string of logic. But Yitzchak was on a roll, and sensing that he was on to something, he continued his line of reasoning with renewed energy. It is quoted at an illogical point. I'm not going to read that part because that will be giving away a little too much. He opens his eyes to see his brother holding a Bible and flipping its pages at the very beginning. Of course, Yitzchak exclaimed, the very first disappearance in history. How did I not see this before? Because they're talking before, what I didn't say is that their father was kidnapped. The very first disappearance in history. How did I not see that before? Yitzchak looked up at Adir. Adam tries to disappear and hides from God. And what is God's response? He seeks him out with a simple question. Ayeka, where are you? It's like the first game of hide and go seek. God knows where Adam is, but nonetheless, there's a challenging question of Ayeka. Adir thumped his hand on the Bible. Yitzchak, I need to go to Hebron. I think you just discovered where father is, or at least where I need to look. Yitzchak looked hesitant. All I did was point out that I believe this message relates to Hebron. I didn't mean to imply that you should actually go there. Well, one might say you prophesied and yet did not know what you prophesied. Adir smiled and yet was quite serious. Yitzchak, the quote on that note is from the tractate of Megillah. You said so yourself. If someone is hinting to us that there is an entire story here, a whole Megillah, well, I'm not sure yet what this is all about, but I don't intend to sit back and wait for the entire show to be played out at my expense. I'm heading to Hebron. With that, he turned around and headed for the door. A hand placed on his shoulder spun him around. Adir, you may be more the man of action between the two of us, but whatever this is about, it involves both of us. I'm coming too. Adir thought about this proposition for a moment. You know, I do prefer to work alone, but under the circumstances, having your brains around might not be such a bad idea. Now, this is what will lead my two protagonists, Adir and Yitzhak, over to share screen time, back to Google Earth, over towards Hebron. So right now we are going to go from Jerusalem about 60 kilometers, 40 miles to the south over to the city of Hebron. This is the very, very 20th century built up Hebron. 99% of what you see is Palestinian, Muslim, Arab, with a small Jewish enclave around or near the cave of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. And that's what you're seeing here in the small picture over here. I'm going to take you here to the ground level of the cave of the patriarchs and matriarchs. Okay, those who follow the weekly portion of the week know that just a few weeks ago, we read the portion of the week where Abraham is, for the first time, legally purchases a parcel of land for the purpose of burial, of his wife, Sarah. And since we're if we're following the yearly cycle of the portions of the week, then it is these weeks where we see Abram and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob eventually, and Leah will be all buried, 3 couples, 6 people in this burial ground. There is a much later tradition, which I'm not going to address right now, that does appear that also makes a connection between this burial site and the burial site of Adam and Eve, basically claiming that Adam and Eve are also buried here on the site, but it is not a biblical reference. The visual that you're seeing right now, by the way, I'm not quite sure how in almost all these Google Earth pictures, there are Asian people. We do have Asian tourists, but to the degree that I see them in the Google Earth pictures, I'm not quite sure. So here's that nice man there. Maybe he took the picture. I don't know, in a long selfie stick. But here we have the cave of the matriarchs and patriarchs, which really is not. What it is what's called in Greek a temenos. And a temenos is a holy compound, similar in ways maybe to the Temple Mount. So where is the cave? Where is the burial plot? That is underground, and I will take you there. If you've ever been to this site, you know that if you're not Muslim, then you have access through this staircase here. I'm showing you here in the center of the screen, a staircase where I'm showing you the arrow. That is the only access point to this structure, to this facility, as of today, for all non-Muslims, no matter what other persuasion of faith or non-faith you may be. That is the only entrance for non-Muslims. And this, again, is the exterior of this structure. A couple words about it. King Herod designed this. He built it. The same guy that designed and built Caesarea and the palaces of Masada and Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. It is all Herodian architecture, building. However, those other places that I just mentioned were destroyed sooner, later, various times. This is the oldest, at least local, and perhaps even on an international scale. It is the oldest 2,000-year-old building that is still standing and is still functioning in its original purpose. It was built as a temenos. It was built as a gathering area for people to come on pilgrimage to the site of the burial site that was considered very holy. And it still has that same function today. Now, that's not all. Now I'm going to take you inside, okay? So once again, we're sort of taking an aerial view. In a minute, there'll be a picture coming up. This here is a picture from the areas that you can access. This in Hebrew says, this is the grave marking, or the fancier word would be a cenotaph, which is, again, it's a grave marking of Jacob, the forefather Jacob. This is what it looks like. So there's an iron green gate here. There are Islamic elements because it was the Muslims who put it there, but everything around it is in Hebrew. And all of these characters are holy and venerated by Muslims and Jews. That is what we can see here. And of course, there's 5 others, one for his wife and one for his grandmother and grandfather, and one for his mom and dad, Isaac and Rebecca. But that's not all. We have here another drawing, another photograph, drawing, etching. This dates to about 400 years ago, and it shows you the origins of the purchase of what I already mentioned. Abraham is buying this burial plot from a guy named Ephron the Hittite. In the background, you can see there is a cave, because indeed it is, or was, and still is, a cave. And there was no, when Abraham bought it, there was no built-up structure on it, obviously. This here is an illustration, is a drawing done by the archaeological teams that shows you 6 different areas, 6 cenotaphs, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the center, and 5 and 6 on the right. Each one of those rectangles that's surrounded by something else, each one of those is another cenotaph. There is a wall that splits, this black line that goes vertically from the top to the bottom. That is a wall that more or less that splits, give or take 50-50 between what is today the only Islamic site and the site and the side that is only not Islamic. I would say Jewish side, but it's also open to Christians and others. So one side is Islamic or for Muslims, and the other side is for all those who don't answer to that category. But there's also other elements that you can see in these sketches. You can see that there's also subterranean places that are mentioned, even though it's a 2-dimensional diagram. And that, of course, is what is going to draw me and you to our next slide. Now I'm taking you inside the place where I cannot take you. I cannot take you here. Here too, there's a proviso. This is what is called the Hall of Isaac and Rebecca. It is it's on the same floor, on the same level as anybody who's been to the Cave of the Matriarchs and Patriarchs. If you were there, you would have been on the other side of the wall that you're looking at now. But I'm going to turn, sorry, actually, it was the opposite. It would be, no, I had it right. That would be where you would have gone. However, if you look over to this side, you'll see that there is over here, there's like I'm not quite sure how to describe it. There's something, there's a small structure. It's not the mihrab, it's not the minbar. If you're familiar with, it's not the pulpit, okay? What we would call a pulpit or a bima, that's not what it is. It is something else. And here in this photograph, you can see what that something else is. This is a marble stone. It's shaped like a flower. There's an 18-inch, just because you can see the padlock, so you can imagine how big it is. This is 18 inches in diameter, and it's locked. Padlock is important here. And what is that? Here we can see, again, in this drawing here, you can see what I showed you in the Google Earth image, this structure. It looks like a miniature minaret, perhaps. Here is that flower marble stone where I'm pointing now with the cursor. And again, just for the sense of proportions, here's an individual standing next to it. And here there's a vertical shaft that goes down one level and then another level down here. From this point, there is a passageway that veers off to the right. That will lead to another similar style opening, like you can see here, but just on the other side of the Hall of Isaac and Rebecca. And underneath this chamber, you can look at it as perhaps 1 or 2 chambers, but underneath this, there's yet another cave. And this cave actually is also a double cave. Here's one here, and here's another one over here. And essentially what this shows us is a very interesting understanding to what Ma'arat HaMachpelah means, because literally Ma'ara is a cave, Machpelah implies double. So different people have suggested different meanings, what the double nature, what the duality, what the nature of duality, what that might be regarding this cave. Some people have said, well, of course it's the double cave because all the couples, the biblical couples got married there. That's why, they come in pairs, Abraham and Sarah and so forth. That's why it's called the doubled cave. Even though it was bought before Abraham was dead, nonetheless, it was somewhat prophetic. Other people say, no, there are 2 caves, vertical caves. It is one cave on top of another cave. And this is a Talmudic opinion. And another Talmudic opinion says, no, there were 2 caves, but they were horizontal. There was one cave, and at the end of that cave, there was yet another cave. And perhaps, as often is the case, nobody is wrong. They are all correct. They're just focusing on different elements. And indeed, here you can see that perhaps indeed all three are right. I have two horizontal caves in the bottom. I have two vertical caves, one on top of each other. And we've already seen that it is also a cave that has pears buried in it from the biblical era. So that is a little bit more about Isaac's Hall and the areas that I can't take you to. I said there's maybe a couple of exceptions. One of those exceptions is, by the by, there are 10 days and only 10 days out of the 365 in the calendar year where I can take you to this hall, but only 10 days. It's strange but true. There are 10 days where no Muslims are allowed in and only non-Muslims are allowed in. And to compensate, to keep it even, there are 10 days of year where the entire structure is open, but only to Muslims. And that's the way to keep the balance there. It happens to be, by the by, that only this past week, there was a very interesting article. There is a certain man named Noam Arnon, who's one of the only living people today, who's ever been down to these subterranean areas. And he also, another claim to fame is he was a long-term spokesperson for the Jewish community of Hebron. And he just completed his PhD on everything that I just said, and oh my gosh, so much more. But that's all I'll say about that right now. But it does play a very interesting point to the book. And from what I just read to you, when Isaac and Adir Yitzchak and Adir in the book understand that the clue is taking them towards Hebron, as you might have already guessed, they don't only go into the area that's open to non-Muslims. They don't even access this area. Well, they do, but not only access the area that you can see in front of you. Obviously, in the book, they even managed to access the subterranean areas that I showed you a few minutes ago. How they do it, that I won't say. But they do, but I won't say, at least not at this point. From here, I'm going to summarize, and then I'll ask if there are any questions and ask if there's any interest in doing an encore as far as another site. We can do maybe one more site, but that also depends on time. So I'm going to stop the sharing here so I can see you again. And just to summarize very briefly, and I'll keep this short because I also have my eye on the time here. People have often asked me over the past 20 years or so, what is Torah education and what is the goal of this book? So to recap, in case there was anybody that missed the beginning, just as I've used leisure tourism as a platform and a framework to educate people in Israel-related topics in Judaism and Zionism and so forth, this book utilizes leisure reading for the same purposes to achieve the same goals. People have been with me, students, clients of all nature have often asked me, Josh, where are we and why are we here? The first question deals with the obvious, why are we here? Eventually, if people spend enough time, and often people do, we realize that essentially what we talk about on our tours is, why are we here, in the much greater, not geographical sense, but existential sense? Why are we here? And it's amazing because that's what the land of Israel does. It brings out these questions, whether it's a bar bat mitzvah child or a business person or philanthropist or federation or school. It's there. It's always just under the surface. And these are the things that I try to facilitate. While the book is mostly entertaining, I also try to tackle the major issues of politics, philosophy, faith, and I think that authors write who they are. And my protagonist is very much, both of them are who I am. On one side, an Orthodox Jew who has background in yeshiva, not to the degree that my protagonist is, like a brilliant walking computer, not that level. And the other protagonist, Adir, who is ex-elite IDF combat soldier, which I am an ex-IDF combat soldier, but not to the levels that Adir is, not in the slightest. So you shouldn't, oh, Josh is oh, wow, he didn't know that. No, but I use often my experiences in the military to build my military and yeshiva to build my characters. And now I have to end with, of course, with the 36, the Lamed Vav. What's that about? So it happens to be that there's a Talmudic tradition that's quoted in the name of Abaye, one of the great Talmudic masters, and he says the following: I quote, "The world has no fewer than 36 righteous people in each generation who greet the divine presence every day. As it is stated," and he brings a verse from Isaiah, "the numerical value there is Lamed and Vav, which is 36. And this is how he reaches the conclusion that there are 36 full-fledged righteous individuals in each generation, and that's what makes the world go round." If you think that is all the 36 is, then think again. I would actually be more accurate and say, think again 35 times, because there are no less than 36 different references to the 36 in the 36. One of them you already know. You don't know that you know, but I'll tell you now that you know. What was the biblical question that God asked Adam? I just read it a few minutes ago, and he asks, Ayeka, Aleph, Yud, Chaf, Hey. The gematria, the numerical value of those letters, is 1 plus 10 plus 20 plus 5, which you know is 36. So is it random that it's 36? Is it random that there's so many other biblical references to 36? I would assume no. And as you read the book, the theme of 36 is incredibly entertaining to the degree that actually it basically wrote itself. Some of them I did have to sort of force in perhaps, but the majority of them called me more than I called to them. So I'm going to pause here and give time. If there are any questions, then we can ask questions. I don't think there'll probably be time to see another site, but that will depend on you and Paul. Yes.
Okay. Do we have any? No. There was a comment about the Marid Machpelah, which I think we're not going to. It's going into politics. I don't think we need to go into it now. But we didn't have any questions specifically about the book. So if anyone wants to write those, please do. What I think we'll do is I know we've been going for over an hour. I'm happy to. What I want to do first, before people have to leave, is just to send you two things. One is a link to Amazon where you can buy Josh's book, because as I said at the beginning, I think it's only fair, since I've invited him on, to give him the opportunity to promote the book and give you the opportunity to purchase it. The second is my email address for those of you that are not on my mailing list and would like to be, and to hear more about the events that we have in English here at the Vegan Center, including this weekly event on Zoom that I host. Then please drop me an email and I'll add you to the list. What I'm going to do is just say that if people want to leave, have to leave, then bavakasha, that's fine. We've kept you for over an hour, and I know that an hour on Zoom can, especially given that we've all spent much more time on Zoom in the last year and a half than we would have liked. But I'm very happy to invite Josh to take us on another trip. For those that wish to stay, I'm going to be here, and Josh will be here, and assuming at least one other person is going to be here, then we'll do that. So is that good with you, Josh?
That is fine. I'm just adding my email here. If anybody, the link that you sent is for Amazon. That's for people who don't live in Israel. If people do live in Israel, it would be better for them to contact me, which I'm putting on my email now, jevanchen@gmail.com. That's a better way. That is for all you guys living in Israel. And again, not in Israel, then Amazon is your better bet there. I'm happy to do and to do it briefly, to either to King David's tomb or the Temple Mount. So if people just want to type in very quickly, if you'd rather me take you to King David's tomb or the Temple Mount, each of those has secret chambers that I think that probably people do not know about. I'm happy to do that. While people are typing in their answers, King David and Temple Mount, Paul, I can see the comment here about apartheid and separate but equal in the cave of Machpelah, ? One of the people that have been with me on tour know that there are 3 places that typically I don't take tourists to. I don't take, at least not the standard tourist. And one of the 3 places in Israel is Hebron. And I do take people often to Hebron, but not as a standard tour. And I think that question really highlights the reason why. It is so concentrated regarding so many of the very difficult and strenuous and emotional, religious, political rights and wrongs and issues that we deal with in Israel. It's not easy to digest. It's not easy to process. It is so, so, so complex. So actually, I'm sort of happy that that comment came up there, because that's exactly what my book does. I take people to the place where I refuse to take people. And I never really thought of that, actually, that there are, out of the three places that I refuse to take people in Israel geographically, all three of them appear in the book. And I do it in my own terms in a way that I think will be beneficial. And the reason I don't want to take them is because I want to be beneficial for people. And it can be very challenging to be beneficial unless you're properly prepared for what you're going to encounter. Okay, I'm reading the comments here. And Paul, help me out here. It looks like 50-50.
Wait a second. Okay, time's up, guys. Stop typing. Let's see where we are.
King David's tomb.
How about you, Josh? You count the Davids and I'll count the Temple Mounts.
Fine. Six.
I think David wins. I think there's 3 or 4 Temple Mounts.
Okay, so King David.
King David.
Okay, let me minimize this and pop out the share screen again. Temple here. Okay. If we're going to go to King David's tomb, here we go. Okay, King David's tomb, and again, we're going to do this brief. We're going back to Jerusalem, going back north. King David's tomb is actually divided into 2 parts. Number 1 is the city of David. People might have been to the city of David, explored Hezekiah's tunnel. However, what I would say, I've been working in the city of David. I would say on average, I'm in the city of David as a guide about once a week for the past 20 years. Again, on average, 20 years, once a week. I could probably say that maybe 5%, probably closer to 1% of the tourists that I take to the city of David ever get to see this. It's simply not on the main route. These are 2 very, very large burial caves that date to the First Temple period. It is most likely, I'm not going to get into all the rationale behind it. They were discovered back in 1837 by a German Jewish archaeologist by the name of Weil. And most everybody agrees that it is most likely that these were the Davidic dynasty burial caves. Not personal burial chambers, not a wealthy family, but specifically those of the rulers of the city of Jerusalem, which means the Davidic dynasty dating back to at least to about 2,700 years ago, and very likely all the way back to 3,000 years ago. This is one site that also appears in the book, and that is option A for King David's tomb. Now, there are certain people in the audience that are saying, wait a second, not so fast. I was there. You can't fool me. King David's tomb is on top of Mount Zion, and I've been there, and I know what it looks like. And that's not what it looks like. As a matter of fact, this is what it looks like. At least this is what it looks like in recent years. This is an interior of this room, of a chamber that surrounds the tomb itself. Here in the right-hand side of the photograph, you can see half of the tomb. One half is on the men's side, another half is on the women's side. I'll take you to see here again. This is just a different time, so it has a red cover as opposed to the white cover we saw a minute ago. This is actually taken from the women's side. That's why you see a woman there. This is the courtyard of the tomb of David. This is again the white cover. This is what it is. Now the tomb of David is again it's a modern structure. It's a building that has many different elements as far as when it was built and who built it. Some of it is Byzantine, some of it is Roman, some is later Islamic. But people have a tradition from at least 1,000 years ago, and probably a little bit later than that identify it as the tomb of King David, and not in the place that I just showed you, even though there's about a mile in between those 2 locations. Now, this site is venerated by Christians, by Muslims, and by Jews, and all 3 faiths recognize this to be the site of David's tomb. The problem from a Jewish perspective is that the Bible says that David was buried in his city, and the geography of this is not in his city. This is a place called Mount Zion, which is, again, about a mile away from where the Davidic city was. So that's a bit of a conundrum. So either one opinion is wrong and the other is right, or one is right and the other is wrong. That's already 2 options. Or they're both wrong, which is a possibility. Or, and I like this one the most, is that they're both right. And it certainly is a possibility that David was buried more than once, and these things have happened in the past. that people got buried in one place, and then for all sorts of reasons, whatever remains there were, and often there were remains, they were reinterred elsewhere. And that's certainly a possibility that I find to be very interesting. But that's not all, because everything that I just showed you in those photographs is all open to the public. It's a holy place that's open for free, and you don't need me to go there. What you need me for, one moment, please. What you need me for is for this. Aha. Now, this is an image taken from a book that was published over 100 years ago, basically about over 150 years ago. And I want to introduce this character in just a minute. But first, just as far as what we're seeing, here on, it's two illustrations that are showing you the same thing. The upper one is the aerial view, and the lower illustration is the side view. So we can start with the upper illustration, where the cursor is right now. That is that structure of the building that essentially I was in with you guys right now. That's where the tomb is located. And here you can see that above, of course, it's not really above because it's an aerial view. Okay, it's to the north of that building, and then stretching this way underground. These lines indicate that it's a stair or a slope. And then it leads to what looks like the belly of a beast. And that, of course, is a cave that has an opening on the left-hand side as well. Now we're seeing the side angle on the right-hand side of the image. You can see, again, the Islamic cap, the Islamic dome that is on top. And here you can see the staircase that descends underneath, goes off this way to the left, and there's an exit on this side. Why, by the way, is there is an Islamic dome is because what we call King David, Muslims call the Prophet David, who's a holy character in Islamic literature and faith, and also to Christianity, certainly to early Christianity, and even today, David is also a holy saint, especially more than anything else, because he is considered to be the great-great-great-great-grandfather of none other than Jesus, because Jesus is from the Davidic line. At least that is the Christian theology and Christian tradition that wants to forge that relationship. And it's a very powerful and important, not just historical piece of information for Christianity theologically, but it's also, I would call what's called a theological imperative, a theological necessity. I'm not going to get into that right now, but let's suffice with this. Now you can say, but Josh, if there's such a huge cave underneath, how come I've never been there, and how come I've never heard of it, and can I go there? And now I'm going to bring up something else onto the screen. Sorry, I need to share screen again. My bad. This is when I get to introduce my dear friend, Imerte Pirotti. Imerte Pirotti, which I'm sure his friends called him that because he's an Italian. He was in the Holy Land of Ottoman Turkish Palestine 160 years ago. Here we have it. He wrote a book. It's called Jerusalem Explored. Now I have to say something about Mr. Pirotti before we continue. Most of us have seen Indiana Jones. Some of us may know that when Steven Spielberg, at least so it's claimed, when he created the character of Indiana Jones, he had a certain early archaeologist in mind by the name of Sir Captain Charles Warren, who was here also in the 1850s and 60s and 70s. If there was an Indiana Jones character, there also has to be the evil Belloc. Belloc was the evil French archaeologist from the first movie, who eventually got melted at the end of the first movie. So if there was that character, that would be this guy, Ermete Pirotti. Now, I don't know the guy. I don't know that he was evil, but I can tell you that he was frowned upon, and I'm being very easy in my wording right now, by almost everybody in that profession. Nonetheless, he was hired by the Ottoman Turkish rulers of Jerusalem to do surveys of the city. He did a tremendous amount of archaeology. He did a tremendous amount of research, and he published a book. The book is called Jerusalem Explored. And I'm reading to you verbatim. That's why I have it on the screen, so you know I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. And here the title is David's Tomb on Mount Zion. And he's writing in his book. Again, the book was never really seen as worth the paper it was written on, because everybody just despised him so much. But that doesn't mean that he was wrong or making it up. And this is what he writes. I visited the chamber, and the chamber he's talking about is the same chamber that I just showed you in February of 1859, having obtained a permission from the Santan is the guy in charge, the Ottoman Turkish ruler in charge. In return for certain services I rendered him, bribes, presents, I recommended him, he scratched my back and I'll scratch yours. That's what it was. The Mohammedan families who occupy the houses about Nebi Daoud, which is, of course, the Arabic for the holy prophet David. I'm skipping a few lines here, okay? As I unfortunately made the examination in the rainy season, it was not very successful. The water had soaked through and run down into the interior so that I was impeded by mud composed of wet soil, ashes, and bones, because yes, a burial chamber remained a burial chamber for many, many centuries. I do not know whether I should have been able to extricate myself from the fetid quagmire if I had not two men with me and taken my usual precaution when visiting an unexplored place of fastening a rope around my body. Again, if this sounds like Indiana Jones, it's because it is. This is what these guys were doing. He made his way down into this chamber. He had to leave rats, mud, gross, yuck. He went out. Eventually, he'll do something very similar on the Temple Mount. And not long after that, that was it. He stepped on too many very sensitive toes of the Ottoman Turks, and they chased him out of Palestine, and he fled. He also embezzled money from these guys, from those guys, from this government, the other government, and that's why he died in obscurity, penniless. And that's why most people have never heard of him. However, as you can see, this is too good. Paul introduced me as now an author, true, but I'm not that good. There's only so much I can make up. And a lot of this stuff, like I said, just demanded research. Little did I know that most people write either fiction or nonfiction. To do nonfiction, you need research, and to do fiction, you need imagination. I didn't know it at the time, but now I do, that I chose the hardest of all paths, and I wrote fiction and nonfiction, so it was a lot of imagination and a lot of research. But that is our friend Pirotti, who did examine those caves. You know what? I'll share one last thing just to show you. Here, sorry, not that. This. When you go, let me bring up this picture again. When you're standing here in front of the tomb, then here on the right-hand side, on the men's side only, by the way, if you stomp your foot really hard, you can hear an echo from beneath. With that, I shall end. Yes.
I think we can still only see the text about when you were talking.
Okay. Sorry. Yep. I'll just show you real quick here. Where would it be?
While you're looking, Josh.
Yeah.
There were a couple of questions which we can finish with, I think.
Yeah.
One was from Mayer, who wanted to know why were people buried in caves rather than in the earth, in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And Lieber asks, what was the location of King David's residence?
Okay. 1 second. Let me just see if I can get this up again. Okay. What are you seeing now on your screen?
You.
Okay. Well, you'll just suffice with me. The point I was just showing you is that that there's actually like a stone. It looks like a normal stone, but if you step on it really hard, stomp on it, you might be able to hear an echo from underneath. And that's where one of the entrances of the cave is. And that is something that also appears in the book. So the two questions were, why are people buried in caves? And the second question was?
What was the location of King David's residence? I assume she means his official residence.
So people were buried in caves. Actually, most people were not buried in caves. Most people are simply buried in the earth. And that's it. You know, you strike out 3 times and you're out, and you're buried in the earth with or without tombstones. However, people from prominent, wealthy, influential, important families were often buried in caves. Certainly in the first temple time period, even before, as we saw in the story of Abraham, and later in the second temple time period. In order to be buried in burial caves, you need to have the finances to buy it, to quarry it. It's something that's passed down from generation to generation. But again, the vast majority of humanity, at least in this part of the world, did not benefit. And it was considered to be a benefit. It was considered to be yeah, look at me, I got the cave. You know, most people did not benefit from that glory, that honor. So again, that's for people who are wealthy and have the means to do so. Now, regarding the Davidic Palace, first of all, just to be fair, as far as academia and the sort of the contrast or the conflict between the world of academia today and where the biblical world stands, David man or myth is still very much of I would say part of the biblical criticism versus biblical as it's written. Nonetheless, in the past 13 years, there have been some incredible discoveries in the city of David regarding where the palace of King David most likely was. And that location would be, if you have been to the city of David, it's exactly as you come into the site. It's underneath your feet. It is accessible to the public, and you can see it. If you've never been to that area, it is on the northern side of what would have been the biblical city of Jerusalem, which today, ironically, is outside to the south of the old city walls. That's where that Davidic Palace would have been. The Davidic Palace was only in its location for a brief time because his son, Solomon, built another palaces, plural, just north of that. And from that point, it will become the administrative center of Jerusalem. And again, you're looking at quite a distance from the site of the top of Mount Zion. So that's as far as that's concerned. I hope I answered both those questions.
Yeah. Great. Josh, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
And for illuminating this for us with typical erudition and knowledge. It's been a real pleasure, and I think many of us who are interested in Israel and love Israel, but don't necessarily know so much about the specific history of the land of Israel and the archaeology, it was really useful and important and significant for us. And I think the book, the novel, the idea of presenting that in a way which is also entertaining and in a fictional account, I think is a wonderful one. And I encourage everyone to get hold of a copy and read it. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Josh, again.
Pleasure, and thank you for hosting me.
Sure, my pleasure. And go to Amazon if you're outside Israel. Email Josh, jevenchen@gmail.com if you're in Israel. And email me, paulg@begincentre.org.il if you want to be on my mailing list and know more about what we're doing here at the Begin Centre for English speakers. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day, great evening, depending where you are, and hope to see you all soon.
Shalom, shalom.